On the night before Christmas Eve in Spain, Manel, a lawyer and owner of a solar power company, and his wife Julia visit his older sister Bullen, her husband Mario, a military officer, and their son Carlos. As Manel and Julia drive home that night, tension arises when Julia, visibly frustrated, brings up Manel's reluctance to have children. During the heated conversation, Julia becomes distracted, loses control of the car, and crashes, resulting in her tragic death. A year has passed since the tragic death of his wife, and Manel, still consumed by grief, lives in seclusion with his cat, Luculo, at his home in Galicia. His only connection to the outside world is through video calls with his sister Bullen and nephew Carlos. Deep in his depression, Manel initially pays little attention to the escalating outbreak of a deadly virus known as TSJ, which is spreading uncontrollably across Europe, despite quarantine efforts. News reports highlight the closure of EU borders due to the complete failure of containment measures, drawing unsettling parallels to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the Spanish government is concealing a critical truth: the virus transforms those infected into violent, zombie-like beings. Despite the chaos brewing outside, Manel steps out of his isolation and drives to a nearby port to sell his boat, which he advertised online. Everything seems normal so far, just like any other day. As he boards the boat to retrieve some documents, he finds a wristband that once belonged to his late wife, triggering a flood of memories from their past. Later that night, Manel has a video call with his sister Bullen, who informs him that her family is being evacuated to the Canary Islands. Worried about being left alone and stranded, similar to the isolation during the COVID pandemic, she urges Manel to join them. Reluctantly, the next morning, Manel packs up his cat and drives to the airport to catch a flight to the Canary Islands. During the drive, a radio broadcast reports the emergence of a new TSJ virus variant with an incubation period of just a few minutes after exposure. The virus is primarily transmitted through subcutaneous wounds and bites, ruling out airborne transmission. As Manel begins the boarding process, the government suddenly shuts down all borders, including air traffic, canceling outgoing flights. Confusion and agitation spread among travelers as emergency alerts appear on their phones, announcing a nationwide state of emergency. Bullen calls Manel, warning him about the rapid incubation of the new TSJ variant, and advising him to return home and stay locked inside, despite the military's evacuation efforts. On his way back, Manel encounters massive traffic jams caused by the sudden lockdown. Realizing he won't make it home by car, he abandons his vehicle and continues on foot, leaving behind the gridlocked streets. Late in the evening, Manel comes across a house guarded by the military. To his shock, he witnesses a man being forcibly removed from the house, heavily restrained with chains and bolts to control his aggression. As the man is dragged out, Manel is stunned to realize it's his neighbor, Tevin. The next morning, Manel receives a call from Bullen, who informs him about a government-organized safe zone intended to control the virus outbreak. However, she warns that larger crowds could accelerate the spread of infection and advises him to stay home for his safety. As her husband is in the military, she promises to come for him as soon as air travel resumes. Later, Manel heads out to gather supplies and finds chaos outside a supermarket. Inside, shelves are being emptied at a frantic pace. Shoppers, gripped by a sense of impending danger, rush to fill their carts, their panic palpable. Every frantic movement serves as a stark reminder of the unseen threat looming over them. As Manel exits the store, a bloodied police officer runs towards him. In the distance, he sees an infected man viciously attacking another officer, leaving him severely injured and crying out for help. Driven by a desire to assist, Manel approaches, but the infected man suddenly lunges at him. Just in time, the officer shoots and kills the attacker, saving Manel. Moments later, the officer, overwhelmed by the situation, takes his own life. Within minutes, the other wounded officer succumbs to the virus, transforming into a rabid, infected being under the influence of the fast-mutating TSJ variant. Recognizing the worsening situation, Manel fortifies his house by barricading doors and windows and installs a security camera, hoping to prevent any attacks from the infected. Meanwhile, authorities announce a strict lockdown, and urge the public to comply with the ongoing evacuation process. As the government enforces mandatory evacuation due to the rapid spread of the new virus variant, Manel's neighbors begin leaving for the nearest designated safe zone. However, remembering his sister Bullen's warning about the vulnerabilities of these zones, Manel decides to stay hidden. When the military comes for him to enforce the evacuation, he quietly hides, determined to avoid being taken to a potentially unsafe area. 2 weeks later, the town has become eerily silent. Its once bustling streets are now barren and lifeless, with only the whisper of the wind disturbing the stillness. Human sounds have vanished, replaced by nature's quiet resurgence. Manel, isolated and cut off from communication, has no idea of his family's fate, and his supplies are nearly exhausted. Desperate to avoid starvation, he suits up in a diving suit, wrapping his hands tightly in layers of fabric and duct tape, as makeshift protection against bites and scratches, and ventures out to scavenge for supplies. Reluctantly, Manel begins searching the neighborhood but finds little of use. During his search, he encounters an elderly woman named Gabriella, who was unable to evacuate due to being wheelchair-bound. Gabriella, also out of supplies, joins forces with Manel, offering her knowledge of the neighborhood. She points out houses that might still have provisions, and Manel cautiously begins to infiltrate them. In one house, he discovers walkie-talkies and a bike, making his search more efficient. By the end of the day, Manel manages to gather a few scarce supplies, and he and Gabriella share a simple but satisfying meal. That night, Gabriella reveals she heard a radio transmission, calling for any survivors to gather at the Arousa estuary, for evacuation to the Canary Islands. Despite Gabriella's misgivings, Manel is determined to take them there, using the boat he once shared with his late wife, Julia. The next morning, Manel prepares for the journey and radios Gabriella to get ready. When she doesn't respond, he rushes to her house, only to discover she has taken her own life to avoid burdening his escape. Grieving the loss of his only human companion, Manel steps outside and is suddenly attacked by an infected woman. After a fierce struggle, he manages to shoot her with his spear gun, narrowly saving himself. The streets are now swarming with infected, making the area increasingly dangerous. Manel returns home and, despite the collapsed communication system, leaves a message for his sister, informing her of his plan to head to the Arousa estuary. With his cat Luculo by his side, and armed with a diving suit and a spear gun for protection, he sets out for the docks. On the way, he discovers that the main highway is blocked, forcing him to take a detour through a deserted quarantine zone, now devoid of any survivors. As he navigates a forest road, zombies suddenly emerge from all directions, launching a relentless attack. Manel narrowly escapes and continues riding, only to stumble upon another abandoned quarantine site with no survivors left. Resolute to make it to the dock, he drives through the area evading aggressive zombies' attack, and soon encounters a heap of dead zombies, likely killed by the military in a desperate attempt to contain the virus. This causes him to lose control of his bike and crashes. Desperately, he tries to restart it, but the engine fails. With zombies closing in and time running out, Manel abandons the bike and bolts into the woods, carrying Luculo. Pursued by a relentless horde, he barely manages to evade them and finally reaches the dock, only to be met with devastating disappointment. Every large boat is either gone or rendered useless. Using an inflatable dinghy, Manel sets sail for Pontevedra and leaves a message for his sister, admitting she was right about the safe zone. Instead of protecting the population, it had become a hotspot for rapid virus transmission. Late that night, the dinghy gets stuck. When Manel investigates, he discovers a corpse with its hands tied, drowned in a horrifying manner. Before he can process the grim scene, he is intercepted by a group of ragged, armed Russian sailors led by Captain Ushakov. One of the crew members, Viktor Prochenko, a former Ukrainian firefighting pilot, explains that the Canary Islands have been quarantined, and enlists Manel's help in searching the area for supplies. Before going to sleep, Manel witnesses another group of refugees arriving, pleading for help. However, the next morning, he's shocked to see Viktor with fresh bruises and is even more disturbed when Viktor denies seeing any refugees the previous night. Suspicious, Manel marks a possible supply location on a map but notices the crew transferring ammunition and rummaging through the refugees' belongings, realizing they're exploiting the situation. Feeling increasingly unsafe, Manel confides in Viktor about a helicopter at a hospital in Pontevedra, where his wife died, hoping Viktor might help him escape. However, Viktor remains unpersuaded. Fearing for his safety, Manel decides to flee on his own but is forced to navigate through the ship's lower decks, where he stumbles upon two imprisoned refugees. While attempting to free them, a guard discovers them and shoots one of the prisoners. Viktor intervenes just in time and in a tense struggle kills the guard. The three escape silently and steal a motorboat. As they flee, the remaining refugee is gunned down by the guards. Viktor fires back but is shot and wounded in the process, leaving their fate uncertain as they speed away from the vessel. As they reach the dry land, the abandoned city looms in eerie silence, devoid of any signs of human life. The remnants of humanity linger like ghosts, as though life itself had been abruptly cut short mid-sentence. When Manel and Viktor arrive at the hospital, they discover the helicopter is gone. Just then, they are ambushed by a horde of zombies. Reacting swiftly, Manel seizes the gun and fires rapidly, taking down the aggressive attackers one by one. Manel brings Viktor into the hospital to treat his injuries. While searching the building for medical supplies, he hears faint sounds of children coming from an air vent above. Intrigued and cautious, he follows the sound and manages to make contact through a small opening. However, his discovery is interrupted as zombies begin swarming toward him. Narrowly escaping the relentless horde, he rushes back to find Viktor, only to discover that both Viktor and Luculo are missing. As the chaos escalates, a glimmer of hope appears when a nurse named Lucia intervenes, rescuing Manel and helping him survive the attack. Once they reach safety, Manel is relieved to find that Lucia has already rescued Viktor and Luculo. In their refuge, he also meets a nun named Cecilia and 3 children, who have managed to survive the outbreak so far. After treating Viktor, Lucia shows Manel another helicopter located in a courtyard swarming with zombies. She explains that there is no direct route to the courtyard, but the boilers below the building provide an alternative access point. However, this path is dangerous, especially for the children. One day, Manel's phone unexpectedly buzzes with a flood of messages from Bullen. As he reads them, an overwhelming wave of emotion washes over him, and he breaks down in tears upon realizing his sister and her family are still alive and safe. Moved by this, he begins recording a reply, but his attention is diverted by the sound of an approaching car. He quickly discovers that Ushakov's men have arrived at the hospital, scavenging for supplies. Alarmed, Manel informs Lucia of the imminent threat, and urges her that they must reach the helicopter before Ushakov's men discover it. Forced to evacuate, the group navigates the hazardous subterranean boiler complex, but soon encounters a locked door blocking their path. Lucia uses axes to break it open, but a zombie unexpectedly bursts through, attacking and wounding Cecilia. Realizing Cecilia is infected, she chooses to stay behind, allowing the rest of the group to press on toward the courtyard. As they advance, they are ambushed by another wave of zombies. Manel grabs one of the children and hides while the zombies aggressively try to break down a door. Just as the situation grows dire, the sound of gunfire rings out, killing the attacking zombies. Peering out, Manel sees Ushakov's men searching the area for supplies. Moving silently, Manel leads the group to an exit and formulates a plan to hold back the zombie onslaught. Using an iron cell as a makeshift shield, they carefully maneuver through the horde of zombies. However, disaster strikes when one of the wheels hits an iron plank, the noise drawing the zombies' attention. The infected zombies swarm toward them, forcing the group into a desperate fight. Armed with axes and fire extinguishers, they battle furiously and eventually reach the helicopter. They manage to seal off the landing pad to hold back the advancing zombies. As they board, a delay in starting the engine allows zombies to breach the fence. Manel leaps out to buy the group time, fending off the relentless attackers. Their troubles worsen as Ushakov and his men arrive, intent on intercepting the group before they can take off. Thinking quickly, Manel cuts open the pad's fence lock, unleashing the zombies on Ushakov's men. The horde overwhelms them, killing them all, but the zombies also redirect their attack toward the helicopter. With no time to spare, Victor starts the departure sequence while Manel fights for his life on the ground. Lucia drops the rescue ladder just in time, and Manel climbs aboard the ascending helicopter, as zombies claw at his heels. The group finally escapes, leaving the chaos and horror behind. As they approach the Canary Islands, Manel successfully establishes contact with Bullen. However, their relief quickly turns to dread as Bullen urgently warns them to stay away. Moments later, two fighter jets streak past their helicopter, signaling that the outbreak has already spread to the Canaries.